Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to understanding the world. I'm Pi.
And I'm Nick. Today is Sunday, May 11th, 2025, and we're diving into some pretty significant global developments we've been keeping an eye on.
That's right. We're going to kick things off with a detailed look at global economics, especially focusing on China. Then we'll get an update on India and Pakistan.
Yep, and after that, the latest from the S2 Underground, and we'll finish up with some key news out of the United States.
Okay, so let's start in China. The reports you're seeing, well, they paint a concerning picture.
They really do. There's a report from Tyson, a Chinese financial outlet, flagging a potential financial crisis, and it seems tied pretty closely to household debt.
Hmm.
What's really telling, I think, is this quote from a state-owned bank branch manager over in eastern China. He basically said, as long as they cover the interest, the loan doesn't go bad. That's all we ask now.
Wow, just cover the interest.
Exactly. It sounds simple, but, it really points to a much bigger underlying problem. Well, it was maybe just a worry back in early 2024. Well, now it looks like a systemic threat in 2025.
How so?
We're seeing these rising delinquency rates across the board: housing mortgages, consumer credit, small business loans. We're talking levels not seen since 2008.
Okay, that's serious.
And the scale. The People's Bank of China reported household loans hit 82 trillion yen by the end of 2024. That's nearly 11.5 trillion US dollars.
11.5 trillion. That's just a massive amount of debt. And I saw the official non-performing loan ratio is supposedly low, like 1.5%.
Right, that's the official line. But, analysts are worried. There's a lot of concern that this number might be hiding the real picture through things like hidden restructurings or delays in classifying loans as bad.
So the problem could be much bigger.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And the sheer volume of bad debt being sold off really kind of backs this up.
Hmm.
In the first quarter of 2025 alone, banks offloaded 74 billion yen in bad loans. And get this, personal loans made up almost half of that total. We're talking a year-on-year increase of 760%.
760%. That's staggering.
It is. And another thing that's notable is how the state asset manager, China Cinder Asset Management, they're moving aggressively into this retail bad debt space.
They usually deal with corporations, right?
Exactly. Traditionally, it was corporate defaults. But now they've shifted significantly towards personal loans. An executive there even mentioned they've ramped up activities since 2024. It suggests maybe a bigger move than just cleanup, perhaps towards, systemic reform.
But it sounds challenging, especially dealing with these personal loans.
Oh, definitely. A lot of these are tied to, unsecured small businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Think dining, entertainment, really fragile sectors right now. And with consumer recovery lagging and those U.S. tariffs hitting exports, well, a lot of these businesses are just collapsing.
It's not just the small business loans, though, is it? The mortgage market seems shaky, too.
That's right. 11 out of China's 12 major banks reported rising non-performing mortgage loans in 2024. It's particularly bad in smaller cities where home prices are falling.
Hmm. And are those being sold off, too?
Interestingly, no. They aren't really being included in those bulk bad debt sales, which kind of limits the bank's options for managing these troubled assets.
So what are the banks doing instead?
Well, they're trying other tools, things like bulk, non-performing loan transfers, issuing asset-backed securities.
Right, ABS, bundling loans.
Exactly. By the end of 2024, there were 530 ABS products out there, covering about 1.18 trillion yen in retail debt. They're also using something called income rights agreements.
Okay.
But here's a key issue. Current rules stop banks and asset managers from actually reducing the principal owed when they restructure these loans. Critics say this makes it really hard to genuinely help people in financial hardship.
Yeah, that rigidity seems counterproductive.
And it shows in the price. Distressed personal debt was trading at just 4.1 cents on the yen in early 2025. Really low.
So with all that, it makes sense that people are calling for bigger changes, like maybe pilot programs for mortgages and those bulk transfers and a personal bankruptcy law.
Absolutely. There's a clear need for, broader structural reforms to handle this rising debt across the board: households, local governments, maybe even the central government.
Okay, now shifting gears slightly, but still related to China's overall economic performance, the latest CPI numbers seem to confirm these underlying weaknesses, right?
Yeah, the consumer price index actually dropped 0.1% year on year in April. It's not just a small dip. It really highlights these ongoing deflationary pressures.
Driven by tariffs, the U.S. trade spat, weak domestic demand.
Pretty much. Analysts point to that sluggish domestic demand and just immense pressure on manufacturers who are dealing with plummeting exports. Even if U.S.-China trade relations might be thawing a bit, the current tariffs are still biting hard.
We saw exports to the U.S. drop. What was it?
21% in April, a big drop. And you're hearing U.S. retailers warn about rising costs because of it.
And producer prices?
Also down. The Producer Price Index, PPI, fell 2.7%. That's its 30th straight month of decline, and the sharpest drop in about 6 months. Really shows the squeeze on manufacturers.
So what's Beijing doing to try and boost things domestically?
Well, they're stepping up efforts. Local governments are subsidizing consumer loans, especially for big-ticket items like cars and appliances. You see this in places like Sichuan.
Right.
They're also trying to promote tourism, making tax refunds easier, expanding visa-free entry for foreigners, trying different angles.
So it's not really moving the needle nationally.
Seems not much so far. If you look at CPI growth for 2023 and 2024, it was only 0.2% each year. Just really underscores how tough it is to reignite that domestic demand and avoid a deflationary spiral.
Okay, let's touch on those trade talks then. The high-level ones in Geneva between the U.S. and China. This was the first big meeting since President Trump hiked tariffs earlier this year, wasn't it?
That's right. Those tariffs went way up to 145%, which triggered Beijing to retaliate with 125% tariffs on U.S. goods.
And trade pretty much ground to a halt, raising global recession fears.
Exactly. So while nobody expected huge breakthroughs from this first round in Geneva, just the fact that high-level officials met is seen as a positive step, probably exploratory, feeling each other out.
President Trump sounded positive, though, called it very good, friendly but constructive, mentioned great progress, and even floated lowering tariffs to 80%.
He did. But China's position seems pretty firm. No concessions under pressure. A spokesperson for their embassy in Washington basically said the U.S. needs to stop the threats if it wants a real solution.
And the impact of the tariffs is undeniable, as we've discussed. China's exports down, U.S. retailers warning.
Right. The National Retail Federation expects import traffic to drop this year, blaming the tariffs directly. And the WTO's warning is stark. This kind of economic fragmentation could shave 7% off global GDP long-term. High stakes.
So what's the outlook? Where do things go from here?
Well, it's still unclear. But some economists think the growing pressure on both sides, inflation worries, supply chain chaos, political incentives, might push them towards maybe gradual tariff cuts. Like former IMF official S. Prasad said, it's not a full thaw yet, but maybe there's hope for de-escalation before things get much worse economically.
Okay. A cautious optimism, perhaps.
Okay.
Now, let's pivot to South Asia. The situation between India and Pakistan.
Yes, so we have reports of an announced ceasefire between Pakistan and India.
Right.
Which is good news, obviously, but, well, we have to remember past ceasefires haven't always held, so its stability is uncertain.
Right. These things can be fragile.
And the recent exchanges, they seemed more serious than usual, didn't they? Not just border skirmishes, but involving missiles, jets.
Yeah, definitely a step up from the typical incidents at border posts. And the whole geopolitical backdrop is so complex. You've got potential alignments, China and India in BRICS, the U.S. relationship with Pakistan. It puts the U.S. in a tricky spot.
And Russia calling for everyone to cool down shows how worried the world gets when these two clash. Absolutely. Especially with Kashmir still being the flashpoint. And China also claims part of that region, which adds another layer of complexity.
That's right. The history there is long entangled, stemming from the post-British partition era. You've got the religious demographics, Hindu-majority India, Muslim-majority Pakistan, and China's claim on top.
So this recent escalation, it started with a major terror attack in India, right?
Yes. Then India responded with missile strikes and air sorties, and Pakistan retaliated with shelling. It moved beyond those minor skirmishes pretty quickly into something more dangerous.
Especially with that trilateral angle involving China and the undefined borders.
Yeah.
The potential for wider conflict is, well, it's frightening. Some analyses even suggest casualties could reach billions if China got drawn in fully.
Billions. It's almost unthinkable. And the economic fallout, too. So many countries have huge investments and ties with both India and Pakistan. The U.S., China, Russia. A major conflict would send shockwaves globally, disrupting resources.
At its core, though, it's still that strained relationship, fueled by the differing religious majorities and, frankly, hardliners on both sides. It's just an incredibly tough diplomatic nut to crack.
It really is. You could argue it's one of the biggest geopolitical hotspots, maybe even more potentially explosive than somewhere like Korea.
Yeah, potentially.
So the ceasefire announcement acknowledged by the Trump administration, it's definitely a welcome development, but we'll have to watch closely to see if it actually holds this time.
Definitely one to keep monitoring. Okay, let's shift now to the S-2 underground intel update. This covers May 4th through the 10th.
All right, so this update highlights the expected rise in summertime violence in the U.S., sort of a seasonal pattern. In the Middle East, things seem mostly rhetoric-focused right now, but President Trump is scheduled to visit, so maybe more concrete news after that.
And importantly, it confirms the India-Pakistan situation. The brief war seems over with that ceasefire agreement following the missile strikes. Casualties were, thankfully, relatively limited in that exchange phase.
Okay, what about strategic movements?
Some interesting activity at Diego Garcia. 2 B-52 Stratofortresses arrived, possibly with 2 more on the way, but all 6 B-2 Spirit bombers that were there, they've flown back to Whiteman Air Force Base in the U.S.
B-52's in, B-2's out. Interesting. And domestic activity?
The Kinetic Activity Tracker shows continued small arms attacks, civil unrest, basically background noise, considered fairly standard levels for the U.S. right now.
Okay. Any specific incidents highlighted?
Yeah, a few regional things. In the Northeast, Newark Airport in New Jersey had another system outage in the air traffic control tower. Screens went black. Serious safety concerns there, and even unconfirmed rumors floating around advising people not to fly from Newark.
Wow, another outage. That's worrying.
It is. And in Pennsylvania, an IED went off inside a Catholic church in Mooney City. Police caught the assailant, described him as a known troublemaker.
Okay. What about the Midwest?
2 troubling incidents there. In Cincinnati, what looks like a revenge killing after a justified police shooting. The father of the person shot allegedly drove his car into a traffic control officer, killing them. Sounds like an insanity defense is expected.
Awful. And the other one?
In Indiana, Hendricks County. An attempted revenge killing related to a tragic high-speed chase involving infants. The great-grandfather of the children involved tried to attack the arrested driver, Sidani Pettis, apparently as Pettis was being brought to court. Although reports suggest Pettis wasn't actually being moved then, the great-grandfather was shot and killed by police during the attempt.
Just tragic all around. Did S2 offer more details on the India-Pakistan missile exchanges?
It did. It mentioned significant targeting by both sides overnight during the conflict. Pakistan apparently hit remote sites in Kashmir, maybe Indian outposts. India then hit 3 major air bases in Pakistan with cruise missiles in response.
So the sequence was terror attack. India blames Pakistan ESI. Indian strikes. Pakistan shoots down an Indian plane. Pakistan launches missiles into remote Kashmir. India hits the air bases, then the ceasefire.
That's the timeline they laid out, yeah. And their casualty numbers align with what you mentioned earlier, 30 to 40 in the initial attack, less than 50 total killed in the subsequent exchanges. Mostly civilians, maybe 36, 40 civilians.
Okay. And back to Diego Garcia, those B-52s.
Right. 2 arrived May 7th, maybe 2 more coming. S2 notes this isn't really a standard deployment, sparking questions about whether they might be used for operations maybe in Yemen or somewhere else. And the B-2's leaving. They were tracked off Hawaii, heading back to Whiteman AFB.
Got it. Anything else from S2?
Yeah, they included some imagery of Tinian Island, that's in the Pacific, site of an old WWII Japanese airbase. It's part of the second island chain, south of Saipan, north of Guam.
Relevant to the whole China-Pacific expansion theory and the U.S.-Pacific pivot, right?
Exactly. The imagery shows a lot of progress building up what they're calling Tinian Island Airfield. You can see a northern camp, lots of logistics, staging down south, work on runways, taxiways.
So turning an abandoned base into something functional again.
Looks like it. Comparing it to older satellite maps, it's a big transformation. Speculation is it could be operational soon, working alongside Guam as another key U.S. base in the Pacific.
Interesting. And one last thing.
Just a brief mention of intercepted GhostNet reports, basically people sharing local news updates via radio messages using a specific tag, kind of an alternative communication channel popping up.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Let's move to news within the United States now. An earthquake in Tennessee.
Yeah, a magnitude 4.1. Happened near the North Carolina border, pretty deep at about 24.9 kilometers.
And people felt it.
Oh yeah, lots of reports of people feeling it, being quite surprised. Geologically, it's the southern end of the Appalachians, likely a reverse fault, which is typical for mountain-building regions under compression.
Now, people might hear Tennessee earthquake and think New Madrid seismic zone.
Right, important distinction. This is not New Madrid. That's an ancient rift valley further west, capable of much larger quakes. This Appalachian event is separate, definitely not seen as a precursor to anything in New Madrid.
Why was a 4.1 felt so widely then?
Good question. The geology there, lots of old, hard shale rock in the Appalachians. It transmits seismic energy really efficiently, much further than, say, out west. So a 4.1 can feel more significant over a wider area.
And historically, what's typical for that area?
Mostly quakes in the magnitude 4 range.
Yeah.
There was a 5.2 back in 1916, and a mine collapse in 2021 registered as about a 4.3. So this 4.1 fits the pattern. Typical mountain quake for the region.
Okay, good context. Not New Madrid. Now let's talk economics again, but focusing on North America. There's this report suggesting Canada's economy is, well, crashing, and that it could signal worse for the U.S.
Yeah, this is based on an analysis looking at Bloomberg reporting. Canada's jobless rate hit 6.9%, and it seems the tariffs are really hitting their manufacturing sector hard.
Oh,
Biggest manufacturing job losses since January 2009, if you exclude the pandemic blip. Ontario, their factory heartland, saw the steepest drop. Windsor, the auto hub, unemployment there jumped to 10.7%.
wow. So the trade war impact is really showing up clearly there.
Yeah.
And the argument is the U.S. isn't immune.
Exactly. The U.S. manufacturing sector also lost 31,000 jobs. Again, biggest drop since Jan 09 outside of COVID. That 1.6% decline is the most since November 2019, pandemic aside.
And manufacturing jobs matter more, economically speaking.
Generally, yes. They tend to pay better, have a bigger ripple effect through the economy compared to many service jobs. So losing them stings more.
What else points to trouble?
Well, Canada also saw average hourly earnings decline. And historically, that trend in Canada has often preceded a rise in U.S. unemployment. So even though the Fed might have thought U.S. unemployment peaked before the tariffs hit hard, this earnings trend suggests maybe not.
So the Bank of Canada might cut rates.
Expected to, yeah, maybe 25 basis points, but the analysis argues that won't fix the core problem, which is the trade war disruption.
And Canada, like other places, has debt issues.
Massive debt loads, yeah. Slowing economy, high debt, it makes them vulnerable. If mass unemployment hits, you worry about mortgages, housing prices, the whole domino effect.
And this ties back to China, too, with their deflation signaling plunging demand.
Right. CPI down 0.1%, PPI down 2.7%. That's 31 straight months of factory deflation now. And China cutting rates or reserve requirements might not help much if people can't borrow or banks won't lend because of all the uncertainty and bad debt we talked about earlier.
Okay, here's a really alarming point from that analysis. 0 ships from China heading to the ports of LA and Long Beach.
Yeah, 0 ships en route, a level apparently not seen since the pandemic. That's huge. It means slashed hours, probably job losses soon for port workers, truckers, warehouse staff, everyone in that trade and transport chain.
Crashing imports definitely track with declining work hours.
Always have. And it's not just imports. The U.S. farm economy is starting to really feel the tariff pain, too. Importers are putting off buying U.S. grain, oil seeds.
And farmers are facing higher costs.
Yep. Expecting to pay more for things like pesticides because of tariffs on inputs from China and India. Those costs, they'll likely get passed on to U.S. consumers as higher food prices.
So the fact the U.S. and China were talking this weekend suggests real urgency to wind down this tariff war.
It certainly points that way. Both sides seem to feel the need for a deal. But the analysis concludes that even if they de-escalate, some tariffs will probably stick around. And that could mean, well, the unpleasant prospect of a stagflationary recession in the U.S.
Rising prices and a stagnant economy. Not a good combination.
Not at all.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the threads really seem to connect, don't they? Global economic pressures, these intense trade tensions, geopolitical flashpoints like India, Pakistan, thankfully cooling for now, but the potential still there, and all of it having very real impacts domestically.
It's all deeply interconnected, which really leads to a crucial question for you, the listener. When you look at all these converging global trends, the economics, the geopolitics, the domestic fallout, what kind of long-term impacts do you foresee? And how do you think this increasing interconnectedness will continue to shape all of our futures?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.